All right, let's talk about taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is a very important area in biology because it is one of the fundamental topics, or main fundamental topics. We talk about the topics that you must know in order to build your strength and in order to prepare you for biology as a whole. So if you don't know these topics, or if you are not very good in these topics, later on you find it difficult to understand biology. So that's why I call it one of the fundamental topics in biology. So taxonomy is relatively simple. So what is taxonomy? Now, taxonomy is simply the process whereby we identify organisms, we name organisms, and then we place these organisms into groups that contain other organisms that look like it. So you have some important components of that definition. We talked about identification, identify the organisms. We talked about naming the organisms, and we talked about grouping the organisms. These three things make up taxonomy. So taxonomy, we define it as the process whereby we identify organisms, we name organisms, and then we place organisms into groups that contain other organisms that look like it. That is simply the basic idea behind taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is also known as classification. Now, a little bit of history about classifications. Throughout the early days of man, we have always wondered about the origin of life, and also we have always wondered about how to classify living organisms. So throughout history, there have been several individuals that have attempted to classify living things. Now, one of the most notable individuals that at least has a scientific background was a Greek philosopher known as Aristotle. Now, essentially, Aristotle's classification of living organisms was not very comprehensive. As a matter of fact, Aristotle just simply told us that we should classify living organisms into plants and animals. His definition or his own method of classification was not very comprehensive. But the modern method of classification, was based off the work of Carolus Linnaeus. So overall, Carolus Linnaeus is regarded as the father of modern taxonomy, or the father of taxonomy overall. So we'll talk about the father of taxonomy. We are essentially referring to Carolus Linnaeus. So back to the definition for taxonomy, we said it is a process. It is made up of three components. We have identifying, naming, and grouping. So the process whereby we identify organisms, name the organisms, and place the organisms into a group or into groups that contain other organisms that look like it. That is essentially what we refer to as taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is a broad term that involves three core areas, three major branches. We have two major branches rather. We have a branch of taxonomy known as systematics. We have a branch of taxonomy known as nomenclature. So we have systematics and we have nomenclature. So we'll take them one after the other. We'll talk about systematics, and when we are done with systematics, we'll talk about nomenclature. Now, what is systematics? If you check the definition I gave you for taxonomy, I said the definition has three important concepts. We have identifying, we have naming, and we have grouping. This aspect of grouping, this aspect of identifying together, they simply form systematics. While this aspect of naming forms nomenclature. So when we are talking about the two branches of taxonomy, we are saying that we have an aspect of taxonomy that is simply involved in identifying and grouping organisms. That branch of taxonomy that is concerned with identifying and grouping organisms, that is what we refer to as systematics. But the branch of taxonomy that is considered or concerned with naming the living organism, giving that organism a particular name, that aspect of taxonomy is what we refer to as nomenclature. Now, remember, when we identify a living organism and eventually we group that living organism. The group that the living organism is placed in, that group is known as a taxon. All of these taxons, there are about 7 of them, they are arranged in the form of a hierarchy, from the biggest taxon to the smallest taxon. So if I get into a group, that group might contain different type of organisms. But within that group, there are some organisms that look more alike compared to the other. So we take those organisms that look more alike and place them into a subgroup, and we obtain another taxon. Now, within that subgroup, we also have organisms among those subgroups that also look more alike compared to the others. We take those organisms and place it into another smaller subgroup, and we obtain another taxon. So the taxons, there are 7, and they form a hierarchy. What are the 7 major taxons? We have kingdom, we have phylum, phylum or division, we have class, we have order, we have family, we have genus, and finally we have species. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you must know these 7 major taxons in biology. Now, not to worry, we have a way we can identify them. Now just remember this mnemonic: king, pharaoh, classified, order, families, generally as species. Just remember this mnemonic: king, pharaoh, classified, order, families, generally as species. So king for kingdom, pharaoh for phylum or division, class, classified for class, order, family, genus, and species. Very simple. So don't ever forget the major taxons in biology. So remember, we say they are arranged in the form of a hierarchy, from the biggest taxon all the way to the smallest taxon. So kingdom, obviously, is the largest taxon in classification. It is also the taxon that is said to be most inclusive. When we use the word most inclusive, we are trying to say that it includes a whole lot of organisms, even organisms that are not very similar. They are present within this kingdom. So if I look at the kingdom, I will see a lot of differences that exist among living organisms. As a matter of fact, by far, of all the taxons in classification or in taxonomy, kingdom contains the largest degree of differences among organisms, or you say the smallest degree of similarities among organisms. Because in this kingdom, we find a lot of organisms, and these organisms may not share close similarities with each other. Phylum or division, we say that phylum is used for animals, division is used for class. So phylum is simply a subgroup of division. Now we can say that a group of related phylums is known as kingdom. We can do the same thing for each and every one of them. We can say that a group of related species is known as a genus. A group of related genus is known as a family. A group of related families is an order. A group of related orders is known as class. Multiple classes that are related form a phylum or a division, and multiple phyla that are related form a kingdom. Very simple. So kingdom is the largest hierarchy of classification. It is the most inclusive. It contains a lot of organisms that may not be very related to each other. On the other hand, species is the smallest unit of classification. It contains the smallest amount of organisms. So therefore, we say that species is least inclusive. But please take note of that word. Kingdom, we said, is most inclusive because it contains an abundant amount and varieties of organisms. Species is least inclusive because it contains a limited amount of organisms as well as a small variety of organisms. So within all of this taxon, species contains organisms that are most identical, most unique to each other, whereas kingdom contains different types of organisms that may not be similar, may not be identical to each other. So if we compare between kingdom and between species, we say that kingdom is most inclusive, species is least inclusive. We say that kingdom has the greatest degree of differences. We say that species have the least degree of differences. We say that kingdom has the lowest amount of similarities amongst organisms. We say that species have the highest amount or the highest degree of similarities amongst organisms. Very simple. So overall, taxonomy, we said, is the process of identifying living organisms, classifying the living organisms, naming the organism, and placing that organism into a group that contains other organisms that look like it. We say one of the earliest individuals that attempted to classify taxonomy was Aristotle, but the modern method of classifying taxonomy was based on the work of Carolus Linnaeus. Therefore, Carolus Linnaeus is often known as the father of taxonomy. Keep in mind that taxonomy has two major branches, systematics and nomenclature. So the aspect of taxonomy that is involved in identifying organisms and in grouping the organisms, we refer to it as systematics. And we say that the groups that an organism is placed in is known as a taxon. And we have 7 major taxons. We have the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Kingdom is said as the largest varieties of living organisms, which may not be identical to each other. So therefore, we say kingdom is most inclusive. That is the word we use to describe kingdom. While species, on the other hand, has the least amount of living organisms. It is the smallest unit of classification. It contains organisms that are most identical to each other, and we use the word least inclusive to describe the species. So kingdom is most inclusive, species is least inclusive. Now, we're done talking about systematics. Let's talk about nomenclature. Now, different individuals, different persons around the world have different names that they call every single organism. So, for example, if I go to the US and I make mention of a particular word or the name of a particular animal, and most persons over there may not recognize what I'm talking about. If I go to China and make mention of a particular animal, the same animal, most persons will not be able to recognize what I'm talking about. At the same time, if I come over here in Africa, in Nigeria, and I make mention of the name of an animal, most persons over here may understand the animal I'm talking about. And the reason is because different persons all over the world have different names that they call every single organism based on the language that is common or the culture that is common in that particular area. So in biology, to ensure that there's a universal language in biology, so much so that if a biologist goes to the US and meets another biologist and make mention of this particular term, a biologist over there should be able to understand, despite the fact that we share different cultures. So to ensure that is a universal language, we name organisms based on a form of nomenclature that is known as binomial nomenclature. So nomenclature is simply the process whereby we give name to an organism. So the process whereby we name an organism, essentially, that's what we refer to as nomenclature. And the most common form of nomenclature is known as binomial nomenclature. Now, what is binomial nomenclature? Look at this word bi. The word bi means two. So binomial nomenclature essentially is a process where we give two names to an organism, two different names to an organism. Now, one of these names is known as the generic name. We call it the generic name, and the generic name comes from the genus. The other name is known as a specific name. The specific name comes from the species. So we have two names that make up the binomial nomenclature of every single organism. We have the generic name and we have the specific name. The generic name comes from the genus, the specific name comes from the species. Now the generic name usually starts with a capital letter. So for example, usually start with a capital letter, while every other one, including the specific name, always starts with small letter. For example, if I want to write the binomial nomenclature for man, I will not say that it is Homo sapiens. This first letter is supposed to start with a capital letter, but this one is not supposed to start with a capital letter, a small letter. So the binomial nomenclature for man becomes Homo sapiens. So this name is gotten from the genus, while this one is gotten from the species. So almost every single animal on Earth or every single organism on Earth is given a binomial nomenclature. So what are some common organisms and what are their binomial nomenclature? For man, we already mentioned, for man we said we can have Homo sapiens, We can also have, for dog, we can also have Musca domestica, or rather Canis domestica. For house lion, we can also have Musca domestica. For onion, we can have Allium cepa. For mango, we can have Magnifera indica. Now, every single organism, so we have a lot of organisms, and each of the organisms has their own binomial nomenclature. For elephants, we have Loxodonta africana. For elephant grass, we have Oxonopus compressus. So there are a lot of organisms, and the organisms have their binomial nomenclature. So as a biology student, you must make yourself very familiar with organisms and their binomial nomenclature. So overall, let me quickly relate systematics and this binomial nomenclature by showing you something very interesting. Now remember we said that the whole idea behind taxonomy is simply to classify living organisms, name the living organisms and place it into groups that contain other organisms that look like it. Now for systematics, we say systematics is simply the placing of the organisms into groups. The groups will refer to them as the taxons. And what are the groups? We have kingdom, we have phylum, we have class, we have order, we have family, we have genus, and we have species. So let's show you how we classify man all the way from kingdom down to species. So first of all, man is biologically an animal. So we must place man into a kingdom that contains all animals. And that kingdom is known as kingdom Animalia. Now, if we get into kingdom Animalia, we'll find a lot of organisms that are very, very similar to each other. As a matter of fact, we have some organisms that possess a structure known as a notochord. We'll talk more about it as we proceed in biology. So those organisms that possess that notochord, of which man is an example, we classify them under chordata. Under chordata, we have a subgroup of animals that are characterized by the possession of mammary glands. So we classify them under Mammalia. So Mammalia, they are members of this chordata that possess mammary glands. Under Mammalia, we have some animals present that possess grasping fingers, just the way I'm wrapping my hands around this marker. These organisms have the ability to hold on to objects. We refer to those organisms as primates. We have humanoid primates. We classify them under Hominidae. And then we have ancestors, Homo. And then we have a specific name, which is sapien. So this is where we get our binomial nomenclature from, Homo and sapien. So overall, beginning from kingdom all the way to species, we have Animalia, chordata, Mammalia, primates, Hominidae, Homo sapien. Now this applies to every single plant, applies to every single animal that has a binomial nomenclature. So a quick summary of everything we've said so far. We say taxonomy is simply the process whereby we identify organisms, classify organisms, name the organisms. We place the organism into groups that contain other organisms that look like it. And we also said that one of the earliest well-recognized accounts of classification was made by Aristotle, but the modern method of classification was based off the work of Carolus Linnaeus. And therefore, Carolus Linnaeus is regarded as the father of taxonomy, the father of systematics, as well as the father of binomial nomenclature. We said that taxonomy is divided into two core areas. We have systematics and we have binomial nomenclature, where we say that systematics is the aspect that is concerned with grouping, identifying organisms and grouping the organisms, whereas binomial nomenclature is the aspect that is concerned with naming the organism. Remember that binomial nomenclature consists is the process of giving two names to the organisms, and these two names include the generic name as well as the specific name. So, for example, the binomial nomenclature for man is Homo sapien, where Homo comes from the genus and sapiens comes from the species.